Welcome to Research into the Classroom, and today we are joined by Jeffrey Boakye, and we're going to be talking about the EDI shift from good intentions to lasting impact. So first of all, thank you very much for joining us, Jeffrey.
No problem, and thank you for having me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation, and it's a privilege to be here.
Well, let's get started then. Could you tell us a little bit about your journey into education?
Yeah, well, I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's worth saying that I started off my journey in education as a student. That's really important to say because it means that you're kind of entering education at that point, and I didn't reflect on that until way later. So I was a good student, I stayed in mainstream education, I made it all the way through the slalom, got to university, got a first, all right, work hard. I actually enjoyed my degree. Thank you. And then I knew that I would one day work with young people and children because I'd always liked doing things like play schemes and summer camps, and I just liked the energy of working with children. I'm a little bit of a kids entertainer at heart. But I didn't go into teaching straight out of university. I did some other stuff in editorial work, journalism, kind of trade journalism. And that's important to say because I definitely experienced the world outside of education that sometimes teachers refer to as the real world, quote unquote. Then, after a few years of doing that, I thought, you know what, I'm not using all of myself. Let's go into teaching. I know that I love literature, language, English, and I know that I could do this well. And so I decided to do my PGCE in my kind of early to mid 20s, and that was my trajectory from that point in. And then I was in the classroom for 16 years. Is that long or short? Who knows? But that's my rough kind of biography as to how I got into education professionally.
Once you're in education, what was it that drew you to focus so extensively on issues around equality, diversity and inclusion?
Yeah, it's very simple. You have to remember that when you enter any sector, any space, any room, the one thing that you're trying to do is actually not upset the status quo. That's called survival. That's part of socialization. And it was the exact same for me. I entered teaching as a black teacher, right? And I was in a quote unquote minority because there were no other black English teachers on my course. And I'd go into schools and I was often the only black person in the department. In some settings, I was the only black teacher in the faculty, which is interesting. And so I didn't go in with the kind of interrogative mindset. I wasn't challenging education. I was busy surviving the sector. And that means I didn't talk about how I was racialized. I didn't talk about the curriculum as something which is affected by structural isms and ideologies. I didn't really challenge the curriculum. I was just turning up with my tweed jacket and my leather brogues and my copy of Dickens and Shakespeare, trying to be a good English teacher in the vein of English teachers that taught me, And so I didn't really look at the curriculum critically from that perspective at all for a number of years. But obviously, as a black educator, you're experiencing certain things. I think this is true for all educators, but I was experiencing a curriculum that wasn't speaking to my blackness, to my black identity, to legacies of imperialism, colonialism, white supremacy. And I could see that in the curriculum, in the classroom, in the cultures that I was part of. At some point, that's going to start to grate. And that's just the way it works. And what do you do with that energy? You can internalize it, or you can let it reflect back into your work. But if you don't want to upset the status quo, the risk that you're taking by vocalizing these concerns is you're risking becoming the problem. And so I didn't talk about it, and I talk about this a lot in one of my books. I Heard What You Said, how I was quite unchallenging of the curriculum. But then I wrote a book, and when you write a book, people read it. This book was about my black identity, and suddenly the cat was out of the bag. It's like people knew that I was a black teacher. And at that point, I realized that my perspective on education, from that particular vantage point, I like to see marginalization actually as a vantage point. You get insights that you can't see from the center. It allowed me to not only challenge the curriculum, but to find ways of illuminating it, making it better, asking the right questions. And that really galvanized my teaching in that direction, to think about, well, how can anti-racism be what I do in the classroom? How can it make my teaching better? How can it improve the culture of my classrooms? How can it support the teaching and learning that I'm taking part in? And that was a real game changer for me. That was a long answer to a very short question.
No, not at all. That whole idea of that survival period. Did you feel, was it a sense of frustration at that point? Or were you quite happy to just be in survival mode?
I think that anyone who is entering a space which is dominated by a dominant identity knows the feeling of having to minimize yourself in order to basically not upset the host. And that feeling is one that requires a sharp intake of breath whenever you step into the space. So I was going into teaching. Remember, my whole PGCE, blackness was never talked about. My racial identity was never mentioned or highlighted in any way. It wasn't talked about. The legacy of anti-racism work in education, the legacy of colonial kind of imprints on the curriculum, none of this was talked about. European imperialism, none of it. Which means that I'm knowing things in my lived experience and from my wider reading and research and from the communities that I'm part of that I'm not talking about. It's actually quite tragic in a way, because a good community is one that is inclusive in the truest sense. That doesn't mean invite everyone to the table and everyone's happy. That's what people think inclusion means. Inclusion means everyone having the vulnerability to accept there's things they don't know. And the dominant identity, which in this case, in this instance, we're talking about whiteness, whatever that means. Remember, it's a racialized term invented in the 1600s. Whiteness, Britishness, imperialism, white supremacy is the dominant ideology which doesn't want to be challenged. And that's the scary part, because we can all challenge these things. We can all challenge the patriarchy, heteronormative homophobia, transphobia, all the isms, all the phobias. We can all challenge them. But those things, when they apply to us and they speak to the part of ourselves which is seen as normal, then they go unchallenged. So the decision that I had to make really was, do I risk my own comfort by voicing things that might be seen as problematic, and actually not just my own comfort but my own stability? You know, like if you get kicked out of a school because you're a nightmare for everyone, that's your job, that's your rent and your mortgage. Or do I make that my argument? Do I make it part of my raison d'etre? And it took a while, because as a younger teacher, less experienced teacher, you're less secure in your craft. And I think that's part of it too. I'm a very serious teacher in terms of pedagogy. I love the craft of teaching. I don't think you can master teaching. And I was learning the craft, and I got to a point where I got confident in what I was doing enough to then start to shape the content, the how, as well as the what, as well as the why. And that was when things really started to change.
So you are a master in this field now. So
well, I don't think.
I'm labelling you as a master in this field. So, in your view, what does genuine and impactful EDI work look like in schools today?
We need to think about the term EDI. First of all, you have to remember we're in Britain. Britain is so good at euphemism. Like, you have to remember that. What Britain is excellent at is talking about what it's not talking about in ways that make it palatable to talk about it. That's what the British psyche is. Because you remember, this is an empire that dominated the whole world without acknowledging the fact that it's shaped by those places that it has dominated. This is a nation with great in the title. You know, it's got an adjective in the title. So there's a real interesting sense of superiority meeting what actually we're humble, we're human. And that's where euphemism kicks into gear. The stiff upper lip is a real interesting psychology. So when we say EDI from a British perspective, we're actually talking about a number of other things that we're not saying. What is EDI? Like, it's 3 letters that you don't even have to think about what the letters mean, let alone what they really mean. Because you're actually talking about anti-racism, you're actually talking about social inclusion, social justice, you're talking about identity politics, you're talking about white supremacy, a term which people hate to hear, but it's not, people doing interpersonal racism and smashing windows. White supremacy is a system out of which this nation and the modern West is built. Western imperialism is tied to scientific racism and white supremacy. I'm not saying that to be controversial or provocative. It's a fact of history. Anyway, I like to redefine what EDI means, because when we look at E, people think, okay, equality sounds great. It's not equality, it's equity. Also sounds good, giving people what they need in order to be the same. But that's not the point of equity. Equity is really about empathy. It's about understanding that other people have got different experiences, different narratives. So when I step into teaching, is my narrative as a black British educator, a West African from the 1970s diaspora, black British Ghanaian son of immigrants, is that narrative even understood by the sector that I'm walking into? Because remember, blackness is not a monolith. There are other black people, like the Windrush generation. You know, blackness has existed in this country as far as there have been coins with people's heads on them. So all these narratives, they need to be understood in order for there to be empathy. Because without empathy, you can't do equity. Then you get to, what does the D stand for? Diversity. All right. It sounds like something to aim for. I think the pitfall that sometimes people fall into is thinking that you have to create diversity in order to make your world look more inclusive. So let's get more different people in the room. That's not the case. Diversity already exists in every space. There's a great wealth of diversity, and oftentimes it's not recognized. So rather than making diversity, it's about acknowledging diversity. Because I've walked into schools where I've been told this is 98% white British. And I'm like, that doesn't mean anything beyond the fact that these people have one aspect of their identity that is white and British. Within that group, you're going to get all sorts of different narratives and experiences that are very different, very diverse. People growing up in care, people who are autistic, people with dyslexic, people with parents and carers in the criminal justice system, all sorts of things. People who have like non-white people in their family. If you go back one step in the family tree, there's a lot more diversity than people think. So the issue with that word is that it sometimes accidentally speaks to the dominant ideology because it makes you see the same as the same. So that's equality, that's diversity. And in inclusion, I've talked about already, it's like the answer to exclusion sounds like inclusion. I think real inclusion is about, it sounds risky to say, but I think it's about submission. Can the dominant identity submit its power? Can it say, I don't know? Can it say that the non-dominant identity might have insights that it needs to learn from? And to submit your power is sort of counter to what we've been conditioned to be like as adults in this world. I mean, look at the most powerful people in the world. They lean into their power. There are very few nations that have a truly democratic kind of like governance system where you give up your power in order to speak to the greater good. So it's about vulnerability. And I feel like the vulnerability that quote unquote marginalized and minoritized people have to have, because you have to be vulnerable if you are an outlier. You have to step into a space where you're insecure. That's a vulnerability that the most powerful parts of one's self really needs to exercise. And I think that redefinition of EDI can help us to make education quite a place of curiosity, a place of vulnerability, a place of seeking connections and exploring contexts, rather than a place of let's solve the problem because we're in charge, which kind of happens at school a lot.
I think what you said there about diversity really kind of hit home there. I've heard school leaders say, you know, we're not an overly diverse community, and it's very surface level, and it's not, as you've said, within those groups, there is a lot.
Yeah, and I suppose it becomes a reference for another thing. So if you're saying we're not a very diverse group, it means what you're really saying is that there isn't a diversity of thought within this group, or our culture and community is over-dominated by this aspect of identity that really speaks the loudest. Whiteness speaks very loudly, trust me, because it's been set up that way since the 1660s to be the thing that you notice, the thing which is, that's why it's called white supremacy. It's not an accident. You know, when Carl Linnaeus in 1767 split humans up into those four categories, he put Europeus at the top and Africanus at the bottom. And that's the beginning of propaganda that says that white Europeanness is supposed to be dominant, scientific racism. And because of that, it's about that being the critical mass of power that everything else has to sort of align to, if that makes any sense. And that's how your education system and your curriculum can end up looking and reflecting, looking like and reflecting ideologies that have been problematic for 400 plus years, you know?
And now I'm questioning myself when I say EDI work, it feels like the wrong terminology. Where you've seen EDI initiatives
Yes.
work well, what does that look like?
It looks like looking with fresh eyes. It looks like noticing from a place of, I don't know what I don't know. Because what I call blind spots are so easy to fall into because you don't know you have them. And that's where you have to start. The world we live in is not normal. We're living in a Back to the Future dystopia where it's splintered off in a weird direction because of the demands of European imperialism and therefore global capitalism that led to a very strange relationship with the continent of Africa in order to exploit people for free labour. We're living in a dystopia. And everything that we have now, unfortunately, is not just an echo of that, but it's actually in that house. We're living in that house. So in terms of what EDI work needs to look like, it needs to look like the willingness to see with a fresh perspective. Because when you are the host, when you're at home, you can't see your home. You don't know what it looks like because you're too used to it. You've been shaped by your home. It's like a straitjacket. White supremacy to me is like the most comfortable straitjacket for white people. It's the same for masculinity for men. It's like a straitjacket. Very debilitating, but it's comfortable. It's like ableism for able-bodied people or homophobia for heterosexual people. It's like it restricts your vision. It restricts your capacity to see outside of itself. So I've seen this kind of work do well when I've invited people to see the curriculum, to see the sector, to see their school, their institution from fresh perspectives. And all that means is asking people to lean into the parts of themselves that are not spoken to. That's where, because you can lose people in this work because no one wants to be told they're racist. No one wants to be told that they're prejudiced. In 1985, the Swan Report, it's 40 years ago, the Swan Report, it's on the internet. Google it, read it. It's fascinating. It's very long. But it was all about racism in schools, anti-racism in schools, multiculturalism in the UK. And the conclusions, nothing's changed in 40 years. And one of the biggest conclusions was what it called unintentional racism had a huge kickback from teachers. Because teachers instantly said, we're not racist people. We are not unintentionally racist. We might have biases, but we are not unintentionally racist. And we don't like that term. And the minute you say that, you're basically stopping yourself from interrogating the thing around you. So to get back to your question, the thing that works, and I've done this, is just asking people to think about the part of themselves that's most marginalised. I think that is really powerful. Because unless you're the most powerful person in the world, or you think you are, you know, someone like, I don't know, Donald Trump probably doesn't feel like he's got any marginalised aspects. He's like, he just thinks he's just power. I don't know. If he's listening, tell me I'm wrong, Donald. But everyone else in the world sort of knows what it's like to be marginal. And when you use that as your vantage point and you look at what's on the curriculum, you look at what's been taught, you look at the culture of education, it leaps out to you what needs to change. It just leaps at you, you know. When I'm walking down that science corridor from the perspective of a woman and I see only male teachers, only male scientists being highlighted, the patriarchy screaming at me, and it's a very obvious step what needs to change. So I think the best EDI work is the work that starts from a place of, well, let's look at the minoritized experience and what's missing, and that actually leads to a strategic conversation quicker than most people realize you can get to.
So let's take the science corridor scenario. So we've got a school listening now, and this afternoon they're going to print off some new scientists, and they're going to have female and male scientists on the walls now. Mm-hmm. So the question is, how do we move beyond that surface level
Yep.
where people just change the pictures towards a more systemic and sustainable change?
I think part of it is to keep being curious. You know, when you got that 5-year-old that keeps asking why, it's so annoying because basically it's never ending. It's a spiral. But that mindset is very important, and we have to remember that as adult educators, we need that curiosity. It's what makes education feel alive every single generation. Every year we do the same thing, but it changes every year. So I think that to go from that surface level of just optics, you've got to start thinking about understanding the root of the problem and asking why. So why is it all male scientists? What was going on in science that is being affected by this clearly sexist ideology? What's the patriarchy doing? When is science kicking off? Where in the world is science kicking off? Okay, this is all European. What else does science look like? What's happening in that part of the world? And the more questions you ask, the more you get into a place of deeper knowledge and exploration. You very quickly realize that, you know, in recent history, you've got the Indian space race being dominated by what they call the rocket women of India, because in the 1980s they decided that not enough Indian girls were doing science, so they invested in it, and that led to this generation of women in India who are basically taking India to Mars. I mean, it's fascinating. Or you realize that the European Enlightenment is not the be-all and end-all of human achievement and endeavor, which is an interesting thing to know, because then you start to look elsewhere, other empires, other parts of the world, and then you start realizing there's a lot to be said for what's happening in the Arabic parts of the world, what's happening in parts of Asia, and what the Moors did. And it just opens up your understanding. But the curiosity is key, and then it allows you, and this is the big thing, to understand what it is about your subject that is essential for whatever it is you're trying to achieve as an educator. That's the key. Because if you're just basically shoveling knowledge into kids according to the best that has been thought and said, which is a quote from the national curriculum, which goes back to the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold, that's a whole other conversation, you're never going to have a vital curriculum that actually does something that you think is essential. So your core values are the thing that needs to lead the conversation, and then your subject, you can hold it to account. I understand English literature not just as great art written by great, usually British writers, but I understand it as a tool of society, a tool of culture, and I can hold it to account, and then I can use it in order to do this other work that I want to do, which is to improve social justice. It's to, you know, make society better, to remove blind spots. That's actually why I like education. But that's just my personal argument. Everyone needs an argument. Otherwise, you're going to be subject to just the winds of, you know, ideology that have been around before you were born. That's very poetic, what I've just said there.
It was, and then if I can snippet that'll be the loop at the beginning of this this episode. I almost feel a bit uncomfortable calling it EDI work now. But when schools are thinking about how EDI looks, feels in their setting, what are the common mistakes or the missteps that schools take?
Two big ones. First is it's something that is controllable and to be controlled. We are conditioned, definitely as educators, definitely as senior leaders in education, to seek control. And that means that you have answers, you have not only strategies, but plans. And that means that you're almost expected to know what's going on. And you're held to account by how well controlled your school is. And that's where the league tables come in. That's where the Ofsted judgments. That's where the school improvement plans. It's all a facade of control, because actually every year what you get is the opposite of control. Anyone that's taught will know this. You get a generation of kids come in and they're living in a world that you don't understand, and you're trying to get them through it, and who knows how they're engaging with the world. When I started teaching, AI was not a thing. You know, transphobia was not even talked about when I started teaching, and that was only 2007. So think about how much the world changes. You know, the things happening geopolitically in the world, that changes every 6 months. So it's a very, very uncontrollable situation. So if you enter into EDI work anti-racist work, anti-misogyny work, anti-homophobia work, seeking to control it, you're giving yourself a slightly false reality as to what is achievable. Because actually, you can't control it. You can seek to understand it, and that's almost as good as solving it. I'll come back to that. The second thing after control is comfort. If you want this to be comfortable, it's never going to change. If I've got a problem in the structure of where I live, if I've got faulty pipes, if I've got wiring that isn't working, there is going to be some discomfort for my house in order to tackle those problems. I'm going to have to break a wall. I'm going to have to remove something. I'm going to have to be inconvenienced. If people think EDI work can be done whilst comfort remains, you're never going to get anywhere, because this is necessarily uncomfortable in the same way that a blinding light is uncomfortable to someone who has just had a blindfold removed after 400 years, which is kind of what we're doing when we're talking about the reality of white supremacy. It's very uncomfortable, which is why people don't say it. I've said white supremacy, 5 or 6 times in this conversation, deliberately, because I've seen whole policies, I'm talking like national policies from countries, who have committed to anti-racist work and they've not mentioned white supremacy once because it's uncomfortable to say white supremacy. But the reality is, you know, people at the receiving end of any of these ideologies, their lives are way more uncomfortable than the dominant majority is ever going to feel. And that's just a fact. As a man, my life is way more comfortable than any woman or girl living in a sexist patriarchy. And I need to be aware of that. So my job becomes to be uncomfortable as a man if I'm ever going to tackle sexism. Same with any dominant ideology. For people racialized as white, I'm not wagging a finger at people. All I'm saying is it's going to be uncomfortable to reckon with this thing called whiteness that you did not invent. You didn't make it up. You're actually a victim of it as much as I am. But not as much as I am, but ideologically you were born into it. It's just that it gives you certain privileges and protections that you don't interrogate because it doesn't want to be interrogated. So yeah, comfort and control. There we go.
When you say comfort, does that mean that schools have to be comfortable that are they always in a position of being reactive?
Yeah, I mean, it's I feel like the reactive piece is what a lot of schools do, and actually there's a lot of good firefighting that happens, but the problem with being reactive purely is that it's not strategic. You want to get to the point where you're responsive. Now, the difference between reacting and responding is like night and day. A reaction will save your life. A reaction happens very quickly. A reaction is usually based on immediate and present danger and harm. But your safeguarding policy in a school can't just be reactive. It can't just be someone's brought a weapon in, someone's been hurt, scrabble around, get rid of it, get rid of that. No. There needs to be a policy way in advance of any incident that is responsive. And I feel as though that's what's missing from these conversations. If we want to keep on using EDI as the catch-all term, the EDI policy needs to be responsive in advance of any incident that you would react to. And that's completely missing. I've worked with so many schools, like hundreds of schools, because I've been doing this kind of work for a number of years now, and I'm constantly I'm inundated with requests from schools to say, we don't know what to do with these incidents. And the incidents are really piling up. It's actually quite scary what's happening in schools, in playgrounds, in WhatsApp groups, online, in classrooms, in terms of like what is essentially interpersonal racism, interpersonal hate crimes, misogynistic and homophobic and Islamophobic and anti-Semitic and all the rest of it. These things are happening in schools. There's no policy. So the reaction doesn't actually solve the problem. It's like putting a bucket under a leak in your front room. It doesn't solve the problem. You're just catching the leak. You need to get to the pipe. You need to understand your plumbing system. And that's more responsive, right? So I feel as though very simple things. And anyone listening, get in touch, because I've been working on some stuff to help schools respond to these issues in ways that mean that, just like with good safeguarding, you're not relying on one person being a firefighter. That's not fair. And it's not that effective either. I would much rather every house in the country had a fire alarm and a fire ladder than just waiting for fires to kick off and then hope that the firefighters can come and fix it for you after the fire. That's not safe. So, yeah, where's the policy and who's steering that conversation? Because the government, local authority, is it private kind of like organisations and non-profit? I don't know. Who's steering the conversation in order to allow schools to be responsive?
So, as an example, then, if you're working with a school who are reaching out for support, what do you often find that work looks like?
It's multifaceted. Some schools think talking to the kids is enough. It's not. You can't just talk to the kids because it's a whole school culture. I find that talking to the kids is great because you can sort of illuminate what's happening, give them the reasons for their behaviours, give them a context. I really don't like patronising people, and that goes to any human being. Like, I don't patronise a 5-year-old because everyone is whole and complete and has knowledge of the world. So when I speak to children and young people, I'm giving them a context to understand their behaviour, and you can see it in their eyes. They know what's going on. So talking to kids is important. Talking to staff is important because staff, again, they need the reassurance that they haven't got all the solutions. They're the kids of yesterday. They weren't taught this stuff. I wasn't taught this stuff. I just said earlier, I made it all the way through the slalom with not a single reference to any of the stuff that I talk about now, right? Which means that they're not equipped to deal with the problem. Fact. When you've got a leaky pipe, you can't fix it. You call a plumber because that person is qualified and has the tools to deal with it. Unless you are a plumber, in which case, break a hole in the wall and sort it out. Most schools need a plumber to come in, speaking metaphorically. So you've got to speak to kids, speak to staff, because that's the school community. Parents and carers are part of that conversation too. But the other thing that needs to happen in terms of it being a multi-pronged approach is you need to have that kind of policy point in place so everyone can be speaking to the same thing. And I think that's the most important thing. Any Ofsted inspection will say the same thing. They want to know if there is a golden thread that everyone can understand. And safeguarding works because everyone understands it. You don't even need to be an expert in safeguarding. You just need to understand that that thing is the same thing as what everyone else is seeing. And therefore the conversation becomes easier to have because that's where your confidence comes from. So I feel as though the practical work of EDI in schools must come with definitions. It must come with shared language. It must come with an understanding of what we're talking about that everyone in the school community can access. And you can also check that everyone understands it. Because unless you do that, you might get into a strange place of, what's it called? Definitional boundaries where people aren't even looking at the same thing and seeing the same problem. And that is where, again, you go around in circles and nothing really changes. I see that a lot in schools too, which I'm sure we can circle back to.
Yeah, I think when you mentioned around safeguarding and that golden thread, and it works so well in most places because it's something which everyone has the same experience or view on. But I guess by the very nature of EDI, then that becomes quite a challenge, doesn't it? Because
yes.
Everyone's coming at it from a viewpoint.
Yeah, the big issue here is definitional boundaries of discrimination. That's the term, which is a long way of saying basically people looking at things and seeing different things. So if there's a racist incident, let's take a real example from a school I've worked with. A little girl says to a little boy, "Go back to the jungle, you monkey." All right, cool. The little boy's black, the little girl's white. Right, they're in year 4. Okay, what's happened there? That conversation alone, that's where you can fall at a massive hurdle. Because one teacher might say, which I've heard, she didn't mean it in a racist way. She was just saying go back to the jungle because she knows that his parents are from Africa. It's not racist. Another teacher will say she needs to be expelled because that's racism and we don't tolerate racism. It's bullying. Another teacher might say what she said was unkind and it was racist, but she doesn't understand it because she's never been taught what racism is. Someone else might say she needs to be taught all about the context of this language, but she doesn't need to be expelled. And you can keep on going like that. But we need to simplify it. What actually happened there? What was that? And if you can't agree, then you can't take the next step. You don't even know where to go. And in that instance, well, it was verbal, interpersonal racist abuse. That's what actually happened. Okay? And if you can all agree on that, then the girl's parents, the teachers, the boy that it was said to, the girl herself, can nod and say, okay, we understand that was verbal, interpersonal racist abuse. Then you need to know what we do with that. Has harm been caused? Sounds like an easy question, right? Well, we don't know. We don't know if harm has been caused. Has the boy been harmed? I think so. Does he understand what was said to him? I think so. Does he know it's racism? Who knows? So then you've got to educate people to know if harm has been caused. Who heard it? They're part of the situation too. Where did the girl hear that language? That might be a safeguarding concern. And at each point in this conversation, if you can't agree what's happening, you have no idea what to do. It's like looking at the leaky pipe in your front room and someone saying, oh no, that's just damp from the window, and someone saying, no, that's a leak in your pipe, and someone saying, no, someone threw some water. You will never go forward until you can agree as to what the problem is. And my thing that energizes me is going into the problem as far back as I can to understand the roots of the problem. That's the only reason that I speak with any fluency on this topic, because I've just gone out of my way to sort of like unearth where this language comes from. Why would that girl say that? What was happening in the 20th century to lead her parents and grandparents to think like that? And what's happening in the media now to bolster it? And I just keep going, and it takes me to the same place. It takes me back to white supremacist ideas. It takes me back to the 17th century, European colonialism, capitalism. Always goes back to the same root. And that's why I talk about it, because, I'm trying to be a good plumber here, people.
And you are being. You spoke a couple of times there about language and the importance of language in the context of EDI. And I don't know whether to say EDI now.
No, it's absolutely fine. It's just that it refers to other things that people then don't say.
But I think my experience with working with teachers and leaders is there's an uncomfortableness about and almost a vulnerability about not knowing what language to use when discussing identity, bias, inequality. Is that a really simple case of upskill yourself?
It is. It's also a case of you have to understand why you use the words you use, where they came from, and who they serve. So bias is a really interesting one because, unconscious bias is a very, very commonly used term, which is used to describe the idea that people aren't deliberately doing things that are biased or discriminatory, but it's kind of in the unconscious of their thinking. But what that language does, and this is why language is so important, is it minimizes the accountability point. Because really, unconscious bias is actually usually implicit racism. But again, this goes back to the comfort issue. Who wants to be told they're racist? Spoiler alert, we're all racist because we live in a deeply racist society and a deeply racist paradigm. I look up into the world and I participate in a racist world. I didn't choose it for myself. I don't like it, but I live in it. Right now I can order something and it gets brought to my house in 24 hours, and it was made by people poorer than me in a part of the world that, for many complex structural and historical reasons, haven't got the money that I've got in this part of the world, and those people are probably black and brown, right? So whether I like it's uncomfortable, isn't it? It's just you don't want to talk about it. So the term unconscious bias is a great example because that term is actually, who is it servicing? It's a term which makes people who don't want to feel bad, it allows them to talk about it in a way which is minimizing. Because it's actually from, there was an essay written in 1998, I believe, and it was about implicit racism. And the term unconscious bias originates from this essay, and it's used once. Once that term is used. it's about implicit racism. But obviously, it's a term which is latched onto. Now, the fear that you've alluded to of saying the wrong thing, remember, we're in Britain. We're in the land of Basil Fawlty, man. This is like, we're so insecure about the facade dropping and causing harm and causing offence, even whilst we cause offence and harm. I mean, that's part of the psychology. So that, I don't know what to say. I'm scared of getting it wrong. That's one of the biggest barriers I've seen to work going forward. And it's actually one of the most common phrases I get personally told to me. I'm scared of getting it wrong. And that's fine. In many ways, we should be scared because we don't want to exacerbate problems. It's why that, to go back to my overstretched metaphor, most of us aren't going to put a sledgehammer through the wall to fix the leaky pipe. Scared of getting it wrong. Now you've got a hole in the wall that you don't know how to fix. So what I think is important is to actually, it's very personal work. It's almost like slightly therapeutic work for oneself. Understand where that fear is coming from and what you're going to do with it. Because usually humans go fight, flight, freeze when confronted with anything fearful. And most people will choose freeze, where nothing happens, or they choose flight, where they run away from it. In some cases, if you go into the right-wing press and into these right-wing sort of like spaces and political parties, they choose fight. And that's nothing new. You know, there's been an English defence league in this country in the mid-20th century, the National Front, the British National Party, you know, Make Britain Great Again in the 1960s and 70s. That's a fight response. You know, Enoch Powell, Rivers of Blood speech, the black man will have the whip hand. That's a fight response to fear. I see fear manifested in many different ways, but it's the same fear. So one of the things you can do, because how do you overcome fear? Well, let me use myself as an example. I was scared to talk about race for 9 years of my teaching career because I didn't want to be that person and I didn't want to risk my security in a sector that I just joined. But when I realised that there's something bigger than me going on and that I was empowered by knowledge of what it actually was, fear doesn't have any room. Like, there's no room to be scared when you've got an argument to make and you know what you're talking about. There's just no space for it. So actually, if you feel scared, the first thing you need to do is to confront the bogeyman and take that mask off and see it's just some guy. You know, you need to be able to say Voldemort. Sorry to use a Harry Potter reference, you know. JK's been cancelled multiple times, but the Voldemort reference is a good one because in that universe, they were scared to say it, and so it gave him power. That's why I say white supremacy. I'm not scared of white supremacy. I'm scared of what it can do to people. I'm scared of its effects on society. But as a term, as a concept, I'll say it. You know? And this is where knowledge, cliche, knowledge really is power. Because the more you know, the less scary these conversations are. That's it.
So if we're looking to create an inclusive curriculum,
yep.
What does it look like? How is it created?
Yep.
You mentioned earlier around it's about speaking to people, getting lots of people's lived experiences and reflections. I just want to add on to that. Do you think the current national curriculum allows for it?
At the moment, not fully, because the current national curriculum is still very much tied to the ideology from whence it came originally. I mean, we're talking about 1988. It was seeded. Kenneth Baker, Margaret Thatcher. The wording goes back to Victorian England. The best that has been thought and said. Essential knowledge. That itself was speaking to a time when there was a clear level of elitism in terms of who had access to education. So the whole point of education in this country, as fostered by the national curriculum, is speaking to a very particular type of culture, a particular type of elitism, which originally did serve the richer boys of the aspiring middle classes. That's kind of who education was for originally, and that's why our government has been dominated by rich boys, essentially, you know, because that's who the system was working for. So in terms of the national curriculum, Does it have a capacity to be inclusive? Yes, it has a capacity to be inclusive. Is it inviting that? Not really, because the currency that it really sort of lives and dies on is the currency of qualifications, SATs, GCSEs, and these qualifications are about, can you jump through the prerequisite hoops in order to get the qualification that the school needs to prove that it's doing a good job. And inclusion has nothing to do with that conversation. You don't need to bring in other perspectives to get these qualifications. So what I think is interesting is, I think a lot about the point of teaching and the point of schools, particularly in the AI world. Right now, if you're really serious, you can get a whole education without going to school. Why go to a place with other human beings and spend time with them, with people shaping experiences and learning for you? Well, the reason you do that is because that contact, that relational piece, is fundamental to our development as individuals and as communities. And that means that inclusion is not only a nice to have, but it's actually the essential part of growth and being a progressive society. Britain doesn't make any sense without social inclusion and multiculturalism. You can't understand this country without it. Look at the English language. Do you have any idea how many words have come directly from Southeast Asia? Indian loan words that we use every day. That's just an example in our language in terms of how inclusion is embedded. So the richness of what we do is hinged upon our willingness to be inclusive. And I feel like the curriculum can definitely do that if it, at every opportunity, asks, who are you? How can we celebrate you? How did we get here? What is your lived experience? What are your insights? Those questions. And this is why schools are so exciting to me, because you get the opportunity every single day. Every day in school, you can ask questions of the people in that community that can enrich the environment. It's so exciting when you think about it. It's like, if there were no GCSEs, no SATs, no qualifications, no slalom to get through, and it was just hang out, learn something, do you know how exciting a school would be? Do you have any idea the kind of dinner party that would be? It'll be a party. It'll be amazing because you'd just be learning, and there'll be no kind of risk of wasting time. You'd want more and more and more knowledge, and I feel like that's where inclusion becomes not only something to improve social justice, but it actually becomes an integral part of a well-rounded curriculum experience, I think. And asking those questions and celebrating difference is key. Everyone needs to be celebrated, and everyone needs their journey and their narrative to be addressed and acknowledged. And that is usually done by just making space for the conversation. And I believe the curriculum can do that because I've done it. I've taught an English curriculum where I've left space for the perspective I don't have. And when you do that, you start to, it's like mirrors facing one another. You start to learn things about the things you're learning and vice versa in the context that you're all in. And it starts to really build in a fascinating way. That's been my best work as a teacher, when I've started with, what do they know that I don't know? Why do they speak like that and I don't speak like that? What do these young people experience that I don't because I'm not 14? Then it starts to grow. And then you meet communities, you learn, and then suddenly you've got a curriculum which is exciting as well as nourishing, yeah.
What changes do we need to see in the next 5 to 10 years?
It's very important that we create cultures of communication, and creating a culture of communication is more than just wanting it to happen. You need to facilitate it. That even might come down to protocols and pedagogies as well. I feel like, because I lecture at Manchester University on a PGC course that sees 700 to 800 new teachers every year. It's one of the big PGC courses. And one of the things I've noticed is that at initial teacher training stage, there's very little emphasis placed on how to develop the culture you want to see. including the practicalities of what happens when you are meeting people in a teaching and learning environment. There definitely needs to be a piece surrounding oracy. I joined the Oracy Commission for that reason, because Jeff Barton and the team, that work is essential, because if you don't know how to meet the public and the personal, which is what oracy is, you're never going to get to this place of actually vulnerability and inclusive communication. I've seen a lot of schools struggling to build bridges between students, teachers, because they haven't got a good culture of communication, which is open-ended, which is inviting perspectives, which is actually true dialogue, which is where you see someone on the same level as you. A lot of education is, unfortunately, it's still top down. And in that situation, anyone who feels as though they're not dominant is always going to react the same way. They're going to shrink themselves slightly because their voice is not that important. So you need to create a culture of curiosity, of sharing, a culture of openness. I would build in time to reflect for teachers. I feel as though the way teaching is set up at the moment, there isn't enough time built into teaching to reflect on what's happening, to inform next steps in curriculum planning. I feel like that needs to be part of the education program every year. And I would also say it's really important for when you get problems in society, in a weird sort of way, they're speaking to deeper problems and telling you what needs to be looked at. So if you're seeing a spike in misogyny, which you are seeing amongst school-aged children, that's very important data as to how the patriarchy is doing something problematic for a generation. So that means that the next strategic step is to understand how the patriarchy is manifesting itself in a negative way for this generation of kids. If you're seeing a spike in racism, then it's telling you something about the way society is shaping itself, and you then just need to ask, why is that happening? If you build these things into education, then education can start to become a tool for positive social change. If you don't build these things in, then at best you'll get people frustrated and firefighting, and at worst you get the same problems perpetuated generation after generation, which is how we're still here 400 plus years after the seeding of white supremacy, and we're still kind of dealing with it, which is just incredible to me. Like, it's like still believing in a flat earth. I don't know how we've not got past it, but anyway, it is what it is. So yeah, that's what I'd like to see in education. Oracy, culture of communication, built-in reflection space for teachers, and allowing teachers to have an argument and giving them the autonomy to live their argument in teaching. So important. If you've not got an argument, I don't know, teaching must be awful if you don't have any argument, because I don't know, you just turn up and you just sort of like getting through Wednesday. It must be weird. But if you believe in something, it becomes vital and it becomes exciting as well as useful.
We design these podcasts to get people thinking and open or continue or challenge thinking as well. When people engage more deeply with this, where would you suggest that people go to? And I'm going to invite you in to please do reference the work that you've done as well, because I think that's a really good place for people to go.
Oh yeah, there are so many people working on projects, books, content which speaks directly to this. The Black Curriculum, if you're on social media, the Black Curriculum is amazing. The work that they continue to do in this area. Everyday Racism, which is another fantastic organisation which looks at this particularly in schools. The Black Nursery Manager, Liz Pemberton, is doing this in early years. I mean, there are some fantastic individuals who are right at the front of these conversations in a very practical way. The Stephen Lawrence Foundation. Books wise, I mean, goodness gracious me, the recommendation list is long. I mean, I'm constantly reading. I'm someone who's seen as something of an expert, but all I know is that I don't know enough. So there's a number of books. Recent reads that I would recommend: The Science of Racism by Professor Keon West. Fascinating book about how racism actually works. using recent research. Brilliant Black British History by Atanuka is a great kind of primer. It's a picture book as well, so just great, a primer into Black British history and how that's been shaped and otherwise. Read my book, of course. I heard what you said. There it is. Pop, 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 pop. But yeah, I just feel like if you're curious, there's a lot out there. I also like to read the reports. I mentioned earlier the Swan Report from 1985. Highly recommend reading that report because, it was written ostensibly as an objective look at multiculturalism and racism in 1985. And as someone who is about the same vintage, I was born in 1982, it is fascinating to look at what was happening when I started going to school and how little has changed and what some of the continued pressures are. So, yeah, I just feel like be curious, understand what you don't know, and ask why, and those will be the next steps as to your own journey into this work, because everyone's on a journey. I am on a journey,
Thank you very much. It's been a really fascinating and thought-provoking listen for me, certainly, and I know that our listeners will feel the same way. Thank you so much for your time today.
No, listen, right back at you. Thank you for creating time and space for these conversations. And yeah, I just hope that we can keep having these conversations and that listeners will be curious enough to seek out more of the same. No worries. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.